You're studying Ted Hughes for your GCSEs and one of your poems is Relic and you want to get an A star, well then stick around because this video is for you. I am going to go through the poem summary, the thematic concerns. I'm going to go through a detailed stanza by stanza analysis, but do stick around till the end because I'm going to show you an example essay question and also real life examiners' feedback and comments on what they want to see if you have this poem in your exam. Let's get into it. So first, let's read through the poem. I found this jawbone at the sea's edge. There, crabs, dogfish, broken by the breakers or tossed to flap for half an hour and turn to a crust, continue the beginning. The deeps are cold. In that darkness, camaraderie does not hold. Nothing touches, but clutches, devours. And the jaws, before they are satisfied or their stretched purpose slacken, go down jaws, go gnaw bare. Jaws eat and are finished, and the jawbone comes to the beach. That is the sea's achievement. With shells, vertebrae, claws, carapaces, skulls. Time in the sea eats its tail, thrives, casts these indigestibles, the spars of purposes that failed far from the surface. None grow rich in the sea. This curved jawbone did not laugh, but gripped, and is now a cenotaph. So that's Relic by Ted Hughes, a very cheery poem from our beloved poet. So let's start with just summarising what is a relic, because it's the title of our poem. It's the central symbol. So let's go through what it is before we look at a brief summary of the poem, and then we get into the stanza by stanza analysis. So the noun relic refers to an object that is left over from an earlier time. The word derives from Latin, which actually means remains of the dead. And this word entered the English language through religious use, referring to physical remains of dead saints. And these were usually fragments of bone, which is exactly what we see in the poem. And these were objects of worship, but importantly, they were believed to have spiritual properties, and we know that Hughes has a great deal of belief, or had a great deal of belief in the spiritual world. So worshippers would travel lengthy pilgrimages to worship these relics and use them for prayer and reflection. And you can see I've italicized the word reflection because this poem is it's quite an objective poem, but it's very reflective on life and the circle of life. So therefore, the title has a religious connotation that suggests a deeper mystical interpretation. So it could be argued that the jawbone is a relic in the religious sense of the word, but more importantly, that Hughes is a worshipper of nature. He believed that everything that governed the world was governed through nature, through the natural world. Okay, so let's do a very brief summary. So what do we see in stanza 1? Well, the poetic persona finds a jawbone washed up along the seashore, and the speaker finds it disregarded along with other dead animals like crabs and dogfish. And this scene illustrates the cruelty of the sea, which is, interestingly, a very different depiction from one we're accustomed to seeing and reading, particularly in the 1970s, 80s, etc. Stanza 2, the persona considers the journey of the jaws and how they were once active and life-threatening, but now they're of no use. They are discarded like everything else. And then the final stanza, the persona summarizes the cycle of life in the ocean, emphasizing the cruelty of the sea, and identifies the jawbone as a cenotaph. And we'll talk a little bit about what a cenotaph is when we get into our stanza by stanza analysis. So what are our thematic concerns that Relic explores? Well, it explores nature's brutality, but within that also not just its brutality, but also how it is objective. It is the circle of life. It's a natural cycle. things are born, things are live, things die. But in that, we are able to help the next generation to survive. Okay. Now the part everyone's waiting for, stanza by stanza analysis with lots and lots of detail about the techniques used and their effects. So if we take a look at stanza 1, so I found this jawbone. So interestingly, the poem starts with the first person, and it's as if they're addressing the reader directly. And this suggests that there's a very important message that's going to be relayed to the reader of the poem. So I found this jawbone. Now, obviously, the jawbone is a central symbol is the central symbol to the poem. We can also say that this is a synecdoche, which means we have something that represents a larger entity. So in this case, it could be representing all of human life, okay, and about the cycle of life and its purpose. I found this jawbone at the sea's edge. They're crabs, dogfish. So here we have a syndeton, and this is where we have words in close succession without any linking words such as an or and, etc. So the purpose here is really to increase the pace, and it does create a shocking image that these dead animals, these vertebrae, these skulls have just been left there discarded. They have been washed up by the sea and left there. And they are broken by the breakers. So, of course, we've got this plosive B here, this alliteration of the plosive B, which, of course, emphasizes the power of the sea itself and also the breakers. And we've got this pun here of breakers because literally they are like wooden beams within the ocean that the waves will crash up against, and inevitably the remains of the animals will also crash up against them before moving towards the shore. But also here, broken by the breakers also sounds like passive voice, that the things in the ocean are the things that destroy. The ocean itself is the breaker. Or they are tossed. So here we've got the longest sentence and when I say longest sentence, I mean physically on the page, this is the longest sentence. And the enjambment of or tossed to flap for half an hour. This really elongates the ruthless throwing of the dead animals from the ocean to the shore. And there they flap for half an hour. So we've got the consonants here of the F sound and the alliteration of the H, which mimics that frantic movement of the animals and almost fight for survival. We imagine kind of fish flapping about, trying to find their way back to the ocean, but unable to do so. And thus they turn to a crust. Of course, emphasizing that it sadly for the animal, it ends in death. But on a much greater scale, it's also about the cycle of life, that everything ends in death. And there's some similarities here to the phrase that's often used at funerals, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. We've got this crust that will inevitably break down into nothingness. And turn to crust, continue the beginning. And this is that first very explicit evidence that we see in terms of the thematic concern of the circle of life and the cycle of life. It is this creation and destruction. When things die, other things are reborn, or just like the bones that have been left on the seashore have ultimately fed other animals that are in the vicinity, and that's why they've been picked clean. And again, this is also emphasized by that caesura, continue the beginning. So it's almost a juxtaposition because we've got beginning and then we've got a caesura which finishes the sentence. However, it's that idea of life as a beginning and then an end and how that cycle continues. The deeps are cold. So, of course, this is literal and metaphorical because literally, of course, the depths of the ocean are very cold. But metaphorically, it also shows how the ocean and its predators do not care about external factors. They do not attribute human qualities to themselves about thinking of others or right or wrong. they only have their need for survival and they do what they need to survive. I do like the colons used throughout this stanza as well. It feels as if we're going deeper and deeper into the ocean as we journey down. And the final line says, "In that darkness, camaraderie does not hold." Probably one of the most important sentences within the poem. And why? Well, we think about camaraderie. This sentence is an epigram, which means it's a satirical statement. It's quite funny, actually, because in saying that camaraderie is a togetherness, unity in being as one. And yet the sea is obviously personified here, but only to emphasize its inhumane qualities. And that's what makes it quite satirical, in that it is inhumane. It doesn't care about people's feelings and thoughts. It does what it needs to survive. And of course, the stanza ends with a rhyming couplet here of cold and hold. We see two in the poem, and they both have a very similar effect, actually. And this really adds weight to the warning here of this kind of entrapment of the sea's brutality, of nature's brutality, in that it doesn't care. Its purpose is to destroy, to continue that cycle of life, be it amongst predators or natural disasters in the natural world. So we move on to stanza 2. Stanza 2, we look now more intensely, if we think back to the summary, we think more intensely about the persona, considering the journey of the jaws and how they never really fulfilled their true purpose, but ended up discarded like all the other animals of the deep. Nothing touches but clutching devours. So there's connotations here of to touch something, which can obviously also connote to care for somebody. If you touch somebody's life in a way, it means that you've done something wonderful for them. So the cruelty of the sea cannot be measured by humanity's scale. There is no tenderness, and instead it clutches and devours. And here we've got this very abrasive consonance of the ch sound, of this kind of emotionless consumption, and almost like the gulping, and just the predators consuming the smaller animals of the deep. But of course, we know that that's necessary in the cycle of life. And the jaws. So we see irony here, because these jaws that would go down, satisfied, stretching their purpose, and eating and dominating, well, what was once dominating is now picked clean by the others, and it's left discarded on the beach. Go down, jaws, go nor bear. So we've got some interesting assonance here of that O sound. And it connects these very strong jaws and their predatorial nature to actually their sadly fateful ending, that they are also going to be gnawed to death and eaten. So that, again, just within that, the assonance, emphasizing that cycle of life. Jaws eat and are finished, and the jawbone comes to the beach. A very, very objective language and description from Hughes. He isn't embellishing, he's just stating that this is what happens, this is the cycle. And here we see that relentless cycle. The jaws, they eat, they die, and they are discarded along with everything else. But interestingly, that is the sea's achievement. So here we see the idea that its power, meaning the ocean, is unmatched. It's nature's ruler. And what's interesting here is that it even suggests that it wasn't even the bigger animals that had played a part in it. It was the ocean itself that has the ability to make these decisions between life and death. With shells, vertebrae, claws, carapaces and skulls. Again, we've got another example of a syndeton. And here we see just an endless list, almost as if the persona, they could continue going and going and going. But of course they can't. But it is that aftermath. And it gives us this image of like a battle, like the aftermath of a battle in the dead that lie strewn along the beach. And that brings us back to that idea of camaraderie as well. A lot of the semantic field almost creates one of a battle of the army. But I think what's very interesting here is that whilst we see the brutality of nature, the landscape, of course, is both grisly, but it's also depicted as very beautiful. Think about what the persona can see on the beach. The shells, the vertebrae, the claws, these are all very white, shiny, natural objects. So here maybe Hughes is emphasizing this idea that, life and death and beauty and horror are more closely linked than one would think, or that in life we cannot have life without death. It is, again, it's the cycle. And so the final stanza turns its attention back to the all-powerful being, which is the ocean. Time in the sea eats its tail, thrives, casts these indigestibles. And this suggests that the life of the sea is immortal as well, because time is also personified. And here we have quite an important symbol of the Ouroboros, and this is a snake. And I've put an image there because it's quite a complex one to explain, but basically it's a depiction of a snake or dragon-like creature, and you can see how it's consuming its own tail. So this is what also is used as a symbol of eternity and infinity. So it's interesting that the sea is depicted as this creature, meaning that it's immortal. And so here we see that the dead animals from stanza 1 will have fed other creatures. Thus, it's also a reference to the cycle of life as well. So you can see how everything plays a part in the natural order of the world. The spars of purpose that failed far from the surface, none grow rich in the sea. And I have a question there, and the question is that did it fail far from the surface? So they talk about how the jaws did not fulfill their true purpose, that they were killed before they could consume and become all powerful. But actually, in fact, did it succeed in its part of nature, particularly given that none grow rich in the depths of the ocean? Again, we come back to this idea of life and death. You're born, you live, you die. So it's an interesting question to raise with this particular poem. Did they actually fail in their role, or did they succeed perfectly well? This curved jawbone did not laugh, but gripped, and is now a cenotaph. So this is an example of an epizeusis. And this is where we have, you can also say repetition, don't worry, in the exam, but if you do remember it, it's definitely an extra analysis point for you. This is when you have the repetition of two words, not just in close succession like a diachrone, but they are repeated right after one another. And this emphasizes that the jaws did not live for pleasure, but they lived to devour. But of course, they could only hold on for so long before they were destroyed by the brutality of nature. And again, the poem ends on another rhyming couplet of did not laugh and is now a cenotaph. Okay, so a cenotaph is a monument for victims of war. So again, coming back to that semantic field of war camaraderie, and this is a monument for those that are unrecoverable, so people whose bodies were not found. So what's interesting here is that the jawbone is obviously a symbol of something much wider. That's why we come back to this idea of the synecdoche. Everyone's fight for survival and an ultimate death, actually. And so this example of the rhyming couplet emphasizes quite a poetic death, that things die and are not remembered, but they have such an important part to play in the world. Okay, so before I show you an exam question, let's briefly talk about form, meter, and rhyme. Don't forget, in every essay that you write, you want to include sections on these three elements. I tell my pupils, my students all the time, try to explore one in each body paragraph. It will really emphasize your analysis. So the form of the meter, it's written in free verse, okay, so it's made up of 3 stanzas, and that's made up of a cinquain, a sestet, and another cinquain. That means a cinquain is 5 lines, sestet is 6, and then it goes back to a cinquain, which is 5 lines again. And then you think about, well, what does that represent? Why is it that we shrink and then grow and then shrink again? Well, you could say that the growth and the shrinking of stanzas mimic the cycle of birth and death. And then also in being alive, eating, and then being eaten and being reduced to nothing. I said it was a very cheery poem. Meter, there's no steady meter used within this poem, unlike some of Hughes's others, like Cat and Mouse, for example. The lines are of approximately the same length, and this really provides quite a steady, also almost meditative tone. And that's what I was saying, that whilst it's a heavy poem and a sad poem about the brutality of nature, it's also just very reflective and objective on the cycle of life. This is what it is. And it may represent and just mimic us following the speaker as they journey along the beach and they reflect on nature's indifference. And you can really link that reflection to the idea of what a relic is and what does it mean. As I said before, people would embark on these huge pilgrimages to go to worship and reflect on the remains of the dead. Finally, the rhyme. There's no consistent rhyme scheme, but rhyme does occur at the poem's most pointed insights. And those are those 2 rhyming couplets we saw in stanza 1 and stanza 3, cold and hold, laugh and cenotaph. And we spoke a little bit about what each of those mean in detail, but we can also use this as an overall analysis of saying that nature shows no warmth or tenderness. And inevitably everything dies and is forgotten. Importantly, however, though, is that it does serve a vital purpose in the cycle of life, that kind of poetic death we see at the end with the rhyming couplet. Okay, now for the last bit. So I'm going to show you 2 possible exam questions for Relic. And then, interestingly, I'm going to show you what an examiner says. This is how candidates can get top marks with this particular poem. So there's a question here of presentation. So how does Hughes present the sea in the poem? And there's one then about an adjective. So in what way does Hughes make Relic such a striking poem? So these are the 2 kind of formats of the CAIE examination questions. So when you're doing practice questions, always trying to see if you can frame questions in both ways for each poem to make sure that you're ready. So for this particular question, in what ways does Hughes make Relic such a striking poem? This is what an examiner said was really purposeful and powerful in getting students and candidates the A star. Responses which focused clearly on striking were most successful. These responses sensitively considered the imagery, such as the motifs of the jawbone, the cenotaph, the myth that we explored with that snake that means eternity and infinity, the personification of the sea, and the references to darkness. Attention was given to Hughes's diction, such as devours and gnaw bear. Answers which described the journey of the jawbone or provided biographical or contextual details were less successful. And the reason for this is that that's not always the case. Sometimes contextual information is vitally important. For example, if you're writing on the other or anniversary, very autobiographical pieces about Hughes's relationships with different people in his life, it's absolutely vital. But within this one, this is not an autobiographical piece. This is a persona's reflection. You could hint that it's Hughes himself, given his relationship with nature, but it's not clear. So I really hope that that's been helpful for you. Do feel free to write down some bullet points, some point sentences in responses to these exam questions, and then we can have a discussion down in the chat. If you are sitting the exam this year, or indeed in the coming years, I really wish you the very best of luck, and I really hope this video has helped you, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye guys.